Hello and welcome to this mini lecture on genetically modified mosquitoes, which I'm subtitling Using Sexual Reproduction as a Weapon. And so what is it that we're talking about? Here we have a website showing a news report from Florida from earlier in 2021, from March 2021, where a number of people are kind of moving in opposition against a proposal to release genetically modified mosquitoes into the Florida Keys. And so what is going on? What's happening and why is it occurring? So as a little bit of a background, these are the Aedes aegypti mosquitoes. I'm probably mispronouncing it. And they're found throughout the United States, primarily in the southern regions. But we can see that they're very likely kind of all the way from Texas, kind of across the south, coming up into Delaware. And we're in that likely region where they're going to be found as well when we're in Pennsylvania. So this is a breed of mosquitoes that is found, pretty predominantly across the United States in very high quantities in Texas and Florida. But what we're seeing with climate change, with the warming of the atmosphere and the climate, they are gradually moving further and further north. And so more regions of the country are likely to be exposed to these mosquitoes going forward. Now, the significance of these mosquitoes is that female mosquitoes in general, not just of this species, but all female mosquitoes will prefer to take a blood meal. Females of this species prefer a blood meal from humans, rather than from animals. And it's especially concerning because there are a lot of mosquito-borne illnesses that can be transmitted by these mosquitoes. The main type of diseases that the aegypti mosquitoes transmit in the United States include Zika, dengue fever, and chikungunya. Mispronouncing that one as well. But globally, other mosquito species can also carry West Nile disease, West Nile virus, which we're hearing about in the Philadelphia area, malaria, as well as yellow fever. And so, what are these diseases? Zika is probably it's going to be the first, but it has a lot of serious birth defects associated with it. It's estimated that 5 to 10% of confirmed cases of Zika during a pregnancy can result in birth defects, things like microencephaly. Microcephaly over here, you can see is basically a kind of a reduced size of the brain, and that impairs normal neurological function. In some cases, it can even cause death as well. And so, relatively rare in terms of the United States, but very serious in terms of the illnesses that can be transmitted by these mosquitoes with Zika. And there have been outbreaks in areas where we've had infection spread. Dengue fever is much more widespread than Zika. And it's estimated that there could be over 100 million cases of dengue fever a year. Less of these cases, again, within the United States, but there was a fairly concerning outbreak that occurred in the Florida Keys in 2010 that appears to have been caused by an individual that was traveling abroad, got dengue fever, came back, and was bitten by a mosquito in the area of the Florida Keys, and then that disease was then transmitted to others in the area. Again, low cases of death, but dengue fever is associated with about 40,000 deaths per year globally. Still, the illnesses can be fairly serious. Since 2014, chikungunya infections have occurred in the United States, primarily in the region of Florida, but also high levels in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The number of cases vary per year. It generally tends to be associated generally in the United States with somebody that has picked it up internationally and has brought it back, and that can trigger kind of an infection that will spread through the community. Again, chikungunya is not one that's talked about a lot, but in individuals that get a severe case of this, they can have debilitating fevers and joint pains that last into the weeks or months, and there are some reports that it could last even into a number of years. And so what is significant? We got these diseases that we want to try to minimize. If we take a look at the mosquito life cycle to be able to try to better understand how it is that we can control the transmission of these diseases, basically what we've got here is an adult Aedes aegypti mosquito here. The females will, you've got a female over here on the right-hand side, will take a blood meal primarily from humans by biting a person, draw the blood in, and then use those nutrients there to help nourish the eggs that she is producing. Males of the mosquito species won't bite. They will feed on like the nectar of flowers and things like that. So the females can lay eggs, normally kind of batches of about 100 eggs at a time, in an area of water. And then they can stay in that water and develop into larvae within a few days, and then pupate within a few more days after that, and then ultimately become flying mosquitoes anywhere from about 5 to 10 days after the eggs are laid. Now the eggs are fairly resistant, and so they could be laid in an area which has water at the time, but if they don't hatch right away, they are protected and they can like overwinter or be in an area that's dried out and wait for another kind of rain to come or another kind of amount of fluid to come in that will provide them with the amount of water they need in order to be able to develop. Now, with mosquitoes, they're an annoying pest, and there's always an effort to get rid of them. And so how can you get rid of mosquitoes in your yard naturally? The first advice is to get rid of any standing water in your yard. These mosquitoes are, pretty resilient. All they need is about a tablespoon of water to breed. And so, if you've got a low spot in your yard, or even, something like flower pots, gutters, even trash cans, anything like that, that just has a small amount of water that would be present for 5 to 10 days is enough for these mosquitoes to be able to lay their eggs, and then all of a sudden you've got 100 more mosquitoes flying around about a week later. In areas where you can't prevent stagnant water, when you have a bird bath, or maybe you've got one of those koi ponds or something. Well, koi ponds, the fish will often eat the mosquitoes. But if you've got a bird bath or pond, they recommend using an agitator to move the water, because the movement of water will disrupt it enough that they won't lay their eggs in that area. It's also advised that you keep your yard trimmed and you stay away from the kind of dense foliage, the dense leaves, which is where the mosquitoes will be resting. And then finally, they recommend that, if you are going to be outside, maybe sitting on a deck or on a patio, oftentimes you're able to keep the mosquitoes away with a fan, because the mosquitoes are relatively weak flyers. So just a gentle breeze, or even in a ceiling fan type movement, is often enough to keep the mosquitoes away from you. In addition to that, there are some more involved procedures that can help get rid of these mosquitoes. A common one that's been used for about 60 years now is the Bacillus thuringiensis israelensis, or BTI. This is a bacteria that's normally found within the soil, and it produces factors, basically chemicals, that would kill the larvae stage of the mosquitoes, and so prevent them from developing into the flying, biting insects. Now, BTA has been approved as an insecticide by the EPA, and it's actually recognized and allowed in organic farming. So it doesn't harm other organisms, and it doesn't appear to harm other insects such as honeybees. And so often what you see, if somebody has a bird bath, they'll get one of these BTI mosquito dunks and then basically put it in there, and it will dissolve over 3-4 weeks, but it will basically kind of release the bacterial toxins into the water and prevent the mosquito larvae from developing. More elaborate control of mosquitoes would be to actually go through and hire an exterminator or a pest control person. This is from an Orkin website. And they'll basically come through and use a variety of factors to, treat the leaves, to, treat the area of your yard with factors that would, kill off the mosquitoes and hopefully, not kill off the good beneficial insects. But still, these are going to be limited solutions. These are things that will work, in your yard, but it becomes a lot more difficult when you're talking about much larger areas. You're looking at the Florida area, you've got the Everglades there. How are you ever going to kind of control what's going on with the mosquitoes in that region, in the areas that are close to large natural areas or large areas that we could have the mosquitoes being found. Now, in the more widespread control of mosquitoes, we've seen that the toxin DDT was an early insecticide. It was pretty effective for a number of years, but within 20 years of use, they were already showing that mosquitoes were developing resistance to it. And so there were strains of these mosquitoes that could be treated with the DDT, and it would no longer kill them. They were resistant to it, and so they had to figure out some other class of insecticide. It was also discovered about 20-25 years after it was approved for use as an insecticide that it was moderately toxic to human beings, especially those human beings involved with agricultural spraying or other types of spraying that had a much higher exposure to DDT than, say, kind of a random individual that may spray a little bit in their yard occasionally. And this is a picture from a New York beach in 1945, and you can see kind of beachgoers in a cloud of DDT here, which is really scary given the thoughts and ideas that we now know about the effects of DDT on the body. Now, most recently, this is looking at a World Health Organization report. The 4 most commonly used insecticide classes have mosquitoes that have developed resistance to that. And so on this chart, we've got a flattened out globe, but taking a look at it, the dark red would be kind of confirmed presence of mosquitoes that are resistant and basically the insecticides won't kill these mosquitoes. And these are the 4 most commonly used. You can see red, throughout China, India, a lot of the Middle East, various regions throughout kind of equatorial Africa, not so much so in South America at this point, but if we take a look at it, the orange, the lighter orange, and the yellow, these are where we have confirmed cases of mosquitoes that are resistant to 3 in cases of the dark orange, 2 for the light orange, or 1 of these classes. And so chances are, if they're already developing the resistance, it's only a matter of time before they're no longer responding to the chemicals that we are currently using to kill them off, to regulate the number of mosquitoes that are present within the environment. And so what this shows then is that the chemical method, the insecticide method of going through and killing them, it works for a series of years, but then you got to come up with new chemicals. And those new chemicals, they may be, harmful to the bacteria, or not harmful to bacteria, harmful to the mosquitoes, but they could also be potentially harmful to human beings as well. And so there's this concern that should we continue developing these chemical insecticides to kill off mosquitoes and try to limit the spread of these mosquito-borne diseases. A different approach has been taken over the last 10 or 15 years. And that new approach is to use the technology of genetic modification to alter the mosquitoes in some way that we're able to control the wild mosquito population. And so we're looking primarily at one company that is doing that in the example I'm giving you here today. And so they've gone through and they've altered the DNA within these mosquitoes in 2 ways. The first way is that they are expressing a fluorescent marker gene, which basically means that these mosquitoes, if you were to capture them and then shine a fluorescent light, like a black light on them, they would glow. In this case, we're seeing them glowing a little bit purple. This isn't exactly what's showing on this diagram, but it's the right mosquitoes with an earlier study that is appearing kind of purplish here. But we'd be able to discriminate and identify these genetically modified organisms versus the wild organisms, wild mosquitoes out in nature. And so this would allow us then to be able to determine if the mosquitoes that are out there are carrying these genetically modified genes as they're going through it. So it's a way to kind of monitor what is the spread of this altered DNA within the population. Now that's interesting in and of itself, but what's more interesting is that they've put in a self-limiting gene. Basically, they've been able to alter the DNA of these mosquitoes so that the females are dependent upon the presence of the antibiotic tetracycline in order to be able to survive all the way through the larval stage, the pupal stage, and then become flying insects that will then go around and bite you and lay eggs. And so it's set up so that if they're, the eggs are hatching in a solution that includes tetracycline, then you will get female mosquitoes developing all the way through. But if you don't have tetracycline, you don't have tetracycline normally within the wild environment, these female offspring are going to die before they become flying mosquitoes. So they're basically dying off before they have the opportunity to bite you and lay eggs and generate more and more offspring. And so the whole idea then, and this is a ABC News infographic, is that they would take a genetically modified males that are carrying those two genes for those two traits, release them into the environment. And so we've got the altered male mosquito here carrying that self-limiting gene, and it's going to mate with wild female mosquitoes. And if they're successful in that mating, he will transmit his self-limiting gene, the gene that he's carrying, into all of the offspring that would be produced. But then when those offspring start to grow, the male offspring are going to be able to survive. They're going to be able to reproduce. But keep in mind, these aren't the ones that bite you. These aren't the ones that transmit the disease. And so the males just being present within the environment have the ability then to, again, potential kind of future generations regulating the kind of population growth of these mosquitoes as well. Now keep in mind that the general lifespan of these mosquitoes is on the order of weeks. And so, the eggs will hatch in about 7 to 10 days, and then the mosquitoes will live maybe another 2, perhaps 3 weeks later on. But at that point, they're going to die off, and you're going to have their offspring kind of populating it. So you have this steady supply of mosquitoes coming out and biting you at night. Now, the idea is that, if this worked perfectly, you'd be able to release them once, and they would stay within the environment and, kind of drive down the number of mosquitoes that are available. But in reality, you're probably going to have to continue to release of these genetically modified male mosquitoes in order to keep the population numbers down. Now, in initial studies in the laboratory and in field experiments, they're showing that just doing this knocks down the population of mosquitoes, the offspring that survive, down to about 5%. And so instead of getting maybe 100 baby mosquitoes kind of developing into adults, you may get 3 or 5 out of that 100 developing. Now, this has moved beyond the theoretical realm, the kind of, in theory, and moved into practice. There have been a few fields tests in this where they've actually taken these mosquitoes and released them in areas. They've had some issues that they've had to resolve along the way. But this is an experiment or a field test that was done in Brazil. I think it was about 2015. We've got in red is one area that was untreated, being treated with the normal kind of chemical messenger, or not chemical, the chemical insecticides that they would normally be spraying in an area to try to kind of regulate the population numbers, the numbers of mosquitoes that are being present. And then the El Dorado region, the green region, is the area that was actually, The green region, the El Dorado region, was the area that was treated with these male mosquitoes, and it was shown that we get about an 80% relative reduction in the number of mosquitoes kind of when they were measuring it. So you can see, very, very dramatic die-off. You don't see the peak in the population. Again, recognize, Brazil's in the southern hemisphere, and so their summers are actually occurring during our winters. And so you can see a spike of mosquitoes coming here when the untreated area. A little bit of growth here, but it's still much more manageable when we take a look at it in the area that's been treated by these genetically modified mosquitoes to keep the population numbers down. Now this is nice in that we reduce the larvae, reduce the number of mosquitoes that are out in the wild, but even more important is that they were able to show that the number of dengue fever cases in this region was reduced by about 90%. And so it had the effect that they wanted. It drove down the mosquito numbers and minimized, or at least reduced, the amount of mosquito-borne diseases within this area. So it looks nice. It looks like it's doing what it's supposed to do, but there's still some ethical dilemmas associated with it. And so we take a look at these. And again, this is kind of extra information. This is, not something that you need to do an essay for or do a discussion with. This is to, just give you a little bit more exposure with some really timely current events that are associated with ethical dilemmas in science. So the first one I'm calling Life Finds a Way. I'm of the generation that saw the original Jurassic Park movie with Jeff Goldblum in it. In that movie, and if you're interested, I'll post the link to just a short video clip where he basically says life will find a way. The scientist is explaining to his character, Dr. Ian Malcolm, and he basically says that, the dinosaurs are all going to be females because the only way that a male dinosaur could develop and have the opportunity to reproduce would be if the scientists are providing them with the hormone at the correct period of time. And so this is very much like what OXITEC, this company, is doing with their female mosquitoes. Their female mosquitoes are unable to survive unless they're provided with tetracycline during their development period. And so what they're doing is pretty much what the doctors, the scientists were doing in Jurassic Park, is they say, we are going to control it, and if they don't have it from us, they're not going to develop. The problem, though, is there's often tetracycline. It's an antibiotic that's used to treat humans. It's often found within sewage, so it's not used to treat the sewage itself. It's just people have taken this antibiotic, the tetracycline antibiotic, and it's gone through their body, it's been processed by their body, and then it's released into the sewer systems, but it can be found in those areas. It's also been shown to be used, especially in citrus groves in Florida, which we're looking at here, to treat bacterial infections. And so that explanation that tetracycline isn't in the environment isn't completely true. It's not in the environment in the areas where they expect to be releasing these mosquitoes, but there are potential that there could be some level of tetracycline in the areas that it may spread to. And so the question then is, should the release of genetically modified mosquitoes that are dependent upon tetracycline for development be blocked until a factor is found until the factor not found in their environment is used to control survival? And so basically try to get away from this life finds a way explanation. Another ethical dilemma associated with this is that, if we take a look at the Science Advances article from 2015, we're seeing that there was a relatively low level of extinctions, cumulative extinctions, over a period of time. But then with the, kind of rise of kind of more recent society, modern society, and definitely a rise since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the extinction rate of a large number of species. And this has been attributed to human activity. mechanisms such as overhunting, effects of introduced species, habitat destruction, as well as secondary ripple effects where you cause something to be disrupted within the ecosystem, and that affects more things to be disrupted later on. And so the question is, should we attempt to eradicate species that are deemed detrimental or dangerous to humans? Should we get rid of these carriers of severe diseases? And, you might argue, yeah, we're talking about some fairly significant diseases that are spread by these mosquitoes, and we don't want those diseases to be spread. So yeah, let's get rid of that. But should we use this technology to eliminate annoying pests that don't cause serious damage? You get the houseflies that buzz around you. They're not going to do anything to you. They're kind of probably not the cleanest organisms out there, but they're not going to cause you to die. They're not going to cause you to get sick. But should we potentially use this technology to limit them as well? So that's an idea. Related to that, disruptions to our ecosystem. The mosquitoes have been very, very successful. It's been estimated that they've been around for about 100 million years. And during that period of time, they co-evolved with other species. It meant that as they adapted, other species adapted with them. And so dramatically reducing a population could affect, the predators that feed upon it. Here we've got a mosquito fish that you can actually buy at Amazon.com. And you get these guys, you put them into, a little pond in your yard, and they'll swim through and they will eat the larvae. They can eat up to 100 larvae a day, which is basically the number of larvae that a female mosquito would be able to lay, in about a week. They usually do about 3 clutches of about 100 eggs within their lifetime. And so, if we're going to go through and eliminate that region, we eliminate those guys, then all of a sudden this fish doesn't have anything to eat on. And we're out in the wild, this guy's going to get hungry and he may, die off just because he starves. It could interfere with the reproduction of plants. The male mosquitoes don't bite people. They don't bite animals, but they go through and they assist in pollination. And so should we be concerned about possible ecological impacts on other organisms that are dependent upon these mosquitoes, when at the same time farmers are treating their fields and orchards with insecticides and herbicides to reduce organisms that harm productive plants? And so we're already using chemical warfare against some insects and some weeds and things like that. Should we expand on that? Is this better than the chemicals that we're using and treating our fields with? And so, again, just a couple different questions that you can ask kind of associated with this, a timely issue, because it's scheduled. It was originally scheduled to happen in April. I think they postponed it a little bit now at this point. But as far as I can tell, it's still scheduled to occur at some point this summer in the Florida Keys. Now, I will post these readings for you on the Canvas site. Just take a look at them. I'm not going to have an assignment for you on this, but if you're interested, there's a Congressional Research Service report from last year talking about, what is the technology. These reports are nice because they're designed as essentially briefing documents for our elected officials to be able to understand the topics that are involved. And then we've got I think this is the ABC News article that I pulled the infographic from, Fighting Zika in the U.S., the Battle Over GMO Mosquitoes. This is a little bit older, it's 2016, but they basically have been fighting this fight for about 10 years now, trying to get approval to release these mosquitoes in an effort to control the mosquito population in Florida. And then finally, a CDC kind of description of these genetically modified mosquitoes. So you can take a look at from the Center for Disease Control and Protection, their perspective about what's going on. If you're really, really interested, here is the link to the draft environmental assessment report that this company provided the EPA the Food and Drug Administration in 2016, that kind of goes through and talks about everything they've done with the setting up of these mosquitoes, what they've learned in previous studies, as well as what their plans are for releasing mosquitoes into the Florida Keys area, as well as their assessment of the environmental impact that would be associated with that. So again, you don't have to do anything with these, but if you're interested, here's some additional information. I hope you enjoy this topic. As always, if you have any questions at all, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Send me a quick email, and I'll get back with you. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Thank you, and have a great day.